Now, perhaps the domain that has witnessed the greatest debate in terms of the relationship between language and thought is that of color perception. And the idea is that several languages differ in the number of color words that their lexicon make available to the speakers of those languages. And so it's an interesting way of addressing the question of whether speakers who have at their disposal different numbers of color words, do they then interact differently or think differently, in other words, about color? And here I want to start with a couple fairly sort of classic studies to then make our way to more recent data. So in fact, back in the 50s, Lannenberg and Roberts compared memory for colors in speakers of English and speakers of Zuni. Now Zuni are people indigenous to Western New Mexico and Eastern Arizona in the United States. And what is interesting is that unlike English, Zuni has only one word to refer to yellow and orange. So there aren't two words to mark the space, there's really just one word. And so what Lannenberg and Roberts did, and many of these studies use the same general technique, is the following. They would take a color chip from this display, and they would show it to the participant. And then what they do is they take the chip away, wait a little bit, and then you show two chips. And the participant has to recall whether the chip that they saw, which of the two it is. Now, what is interesting is that speakers of Zuni do indeed tend to misrecall yellow versus orange chips. So let's say that the chip they had looked at was a yellow chip, and then you show them after a yellow and an orange chip. That's the condition under which speakers of Zuni would tend to sometimes misrecall which was the color that they had seen. So this somewhat indicates that not having two different words to separate yellow from orange sometimes is correlated with confusing yellow and orange a little more often. Now, along similar lines, but only in English speakers, Brown and Lannenberg just tested how good was the memory in English speakers for specific for color tiles. And see, what is interesting and what they found was that colors that had a specific verbal label, red, blue, as opposed to some mix of red and blue, those were recalled much better, as if possessing a verbal label helps us better recall a color. Again, I'd say that both of these seem to support the idea that the type of labels that your language gives you do affect, to the very least, your ability to recall a color over time. Now, Davis and Corbett did a similar experiment, but they compared speakers of Setswana, speakers of English, and speakers of Russian. And they particularly looked at the boundary between blue and green. And the reason for looking at this boundary is that Setswana has only one color to cover the spectrum of blue and green. So they say botula, and we might call that bleen. Sort of that same label covers the whole spectrum that in English we would refer to as green and blue. And what is interesting is that Russian instead has an additional word. So Russian has 3 verbal labels in order to cover the same space of the color spectrum. One mapping on green, one mapping on dark blue, and one mapping on light blue. And of course, the question now is, if I give 65 chips that are all at the boundary, that are all within this green and blue space of the spectrum, to my 3 groups, and I just ask them to sort the tiles in groups, as many as you'd like, your call. Do the speakers of the 3 languages exhibit different patterns, and do they make the same or different mistakes according to which language they speak? And their findings were very interesting. First, overall, they actually found that the sorting patterns were pretty much the same across the three groups. So it actually didn't really matter if you're a speaker of a language that has only one word to refer to the blue-green spectrum, 2 words or 3 words. Overall, the sorting pattern was pretty much the same. Also, it was, however, the case that the speakers of Setswana did more often group blue and green together, as opposed to making a blue pile and a green pile. So although overall there seems to be a general tendency in terms of grouping the colors, certainly speakers of a language that have only one label do seem to more often mistaken languages across this boundary. Interestingly, however, Russians did not group light blue and dark blue in separate piles. They also just did a green and a blue pile. So this starts painting a picture, and we will revisit this a few experiments down the line. It does start painting a picture that there seems to be some coherence overall in terms of how we interact with color and how we process color. And I will explain this in more detail further now. But maybe then there is some flexibility that might be granted by the specific type of lexicon that your language makes available to you. Now, a few years later, Robertson looked again at the two different languages, speakers of English and speakers of Birinmo, which is spoken in New Guinea. Now, the reason for choosing these two languages is that English and Birinmo not only have different numbers of colors. So in English, we have 11 color terms, whereas in Birinmo, there are 5 color terms. But what is particularly interesting is that English and Birinmo place the boundaries of different labels for color in slightly different positions. Let me show you what I mean. So this is a map of where English speakers on average place each of the colors that you see here. So for example, all of this, if you were to give somebody each individual chip, a color chip from the figure you saw earlier, on average, speakers of English would call all of the chips that fall in this interval green. They would call all of these blue, and all of those here purple, and those here red, etc., etc., etc. Now, if you were to make the same map in speakers of Birinmo, you would see that their map, obviously they only have 5 labels. Their map looks different. So for example, they were called, a color up here, sort of this white, then this big color in the middle, this kind of black, red on the sides, and perhaps this yellow. And this is not surprising. As I said, English has 11 labels, Birinmo only has 5. Now here's what's particularly interesting about the contrast between Birinmo and English. See, English happens to have a boundary between blue and green right here. And interestingly, Birinmo does not have such a boundary here. So we would call a color here green and a color here blue, whereas Birinmo would call, colors in the same 2 positions, it would call both null. On the other hand, or vice versa, Birinmo has a boundary here between sort of null and war, whereas we do not have that boundary here. To us, war and null here are both green. Now, so you can set up an experiment as follows. You can show, you can take a chip that either falls on this side or on that side of this boundary, and you'd expect that speakers of English, because that boundary exists in English, should be able to differentiate this color from that color in terms of memory very easily. The paradigm is still more or less the same. I show you a color chip, You study it, and then I take it away for 30 seconds, and then I show you two color chips. And you have to pick which of the two was the one you've seen. Now, if you do it across this boundary here, so if one color chip were here and one there, you would imagine that for English speakers, it should be easier to recognize the correct chip, because we would have called this one here green, and this one on the other side would have called it blue. So it would be easier, presumably, to recall which was the correct chip. Now, this is not the case for speakers of Birinmo, because to them, these two chips, because there's no boundary in between the two colors, in between the two chips, sorry, these are both called null. So to them, those two chips have the same name. They're part of the same category. It stands to reason that they might confuse them more often. The exact opposite should happen if you pick two chips in this part of the space. Now, for a speaker of Birinmo, this chip is called null and this chip is called war. So it should be fairly easy for them to be able to maintain in memory and then recognize correctly which of the two chips they saw. For an English speaker, on the other hand, those two chips both look green. Sure, different kinds of green, but they both look green. There isn't a boundary between these two chips. So to a speaker of English, it should be harder, on average, to recognize, to pinpoint the correct chip, given that these are both green. Turns out, this is exactly the pattern of results that we see. There really seems to be a categorical perception. English speakers were better at recalling colors that crossed the boundary, but did worse on pairs of colors that did not cross the boundary. And the same was true for speakers of Birinmo, but reversed. Birinmo speakers were better at recalling the correct color chip when it crossed the war-null boundary, as compared to when it just was two examples of null. So here, on the other hand, we are seeing an effect of having a lexicon in terms of how we then are able to remember the color of a chip.